This is the RTX 5060, Nvidia's crack at a budget graphics card in 2025, but is it an overhated graphics card, or is all of that justified? Well, in fact, there's one way to find out, and that's the benchmark. For this video, MSI sent out their gaming OC. They didn't pay me to make it, nor do they get to preview it before the video's uploaded, and I don't get to keep hold of this GPU. But back to the 5060, and there's already one major problem with it. It's only got 8GB of VRAM. Now, in 2025, this really isn't a lot, and you will be running into problems, especially if you use ray tracing. Yes, we're going to see this in a bit, but I think any GPU in 2025 that costs $200 or more should have at least 12GB of VRAM in my opinion, and that's what Nvidia should have gave this GPU. But I think the benchmarks should do the talking, and to find out how well this GPU gets on, we've tested it at both 1080p and 1440p. Trust me, there's not going to be any 4K results today. Oh, and this is the first graphics card we've tested with the 7800X3D, so there's going to be absolutely zero CPU bottlenecks today. By the way, all the specs for this system are linked in the description down below. And we've tested using the latest game ready driver, and resizable bar is enabled. So let's see how the 5060 gets on. First game up today is Cyberpunk 2077 on the Ultra preset, and across both resolutions the 5060 gets on quite well here. We're looking at triple digits at 1080p, which is very nice, that's very smooth performance in fact, and at 1440p we're still getting more than 60 FPS, so there's absolutely zero problems there as well. Frame times across both resolutions are looking fine, but to be honest that's to be expected as Cyberpunk's not really a VRAM demanding game, and it's quite well optimised. Next up is Absolute Peak with Battlefield 6, and we've tested it on the high preset, and to be fair on the 5060 and on the development team on Battlefield, it gets on quite well because this is actually supremely well optimised. And the numbers back that up, we're getting 125 FPS on average at 1080p and 80 at 1440p, so no matter the resolution you want to play at, you're going to be getting good performance, even though you could probably enable DLSS at Quad HD. Dying Light the Beast on high, which is essentially ultra, shows no performance problems at all because at 1080p we're getting 88 FPS on average, and that frame time yet again is very smooth, and the same trend continues at 1440p. The frame time is looking great because it's only 5 FPS below the average frame rate of 68, which is absolutely fantastic. Techland know how to optimize a game, and it's almost as if like 2025 is the year of the optimized game. Mostly, if you don't look at Borderlands 4. Anyways, God of War Ragnarok is up next, and yeah, performance at Ultra is not going to be a problem for this GPU. 107 at 1080p with a 1% low of 89 is really good performance in my opinion, and at 1440p the 8GB of VRAM somehow surprisingly holds up because the frame time here is very smooth. It's 72 compared to the average of 79, so yeah, no problems there. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is certainly not an optimised game, and on the high preset we're still getting passable performance. Above 80 FPS on average at 1080p is very nice. That 1% low is just like an Unreal Engine moment. You're going to get stutters in this game no matter what. I've tested it with a 5090, it still stutters. And then at 1440p we go below 60 FPS on average, but you could always do some settings tweaking or enable DLSS and you get back above 60 FPS with no problems. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was a weird one today because the performance between 1080p and 1440p really isn't that bad. I've tested it multiple times and this is just what I was getting. I'm not sure what's going on here. This is because the performance at 1440p is really close to full HD for some reason. I'm not sure what's going on here, but performance across both resolutions is still pretty decent on the Ultra preset, so I guess we can't complain too much even though it's just a weird bug. To be honest, just take this with a grain of salt. So if you just stick to rasterisation on a 5060, particularly at 1080p, I don't think most people are going to be running into that many problems. Admittedly, we didn't really test any Unreal Engine 5 games, so that might change, but it just goes to show if a developer optimises their game, you can still get pretty decent performance on a 5060. This is particularly apparent at the higher resolution because the most unoptimised game here, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, dropped below 60 FPS. Well, I know Kingdom Come Deliverance did, but that's kind of a just a weird result. But esports games shine because Counter-Strike 2 on the medium preset, which seems to net better 1% lows, gets great performance across the board. No matter if you're playing at 1080p or 1440p, you're going to be getting more than 300 FPS on average, which is very nice. Those 1% lows, however, are not particularly the greatest, but they do get better at 1440p, so that might be the sweet spot res here. Rainbow Six Siege gets 1 frame per second less than 500 at 1080p, which is kind of insane, and the frame time is also looking very smooth here as well. And then when we drop down to 1440p, we're still getting more than 360 FPS on average, which is great, and the 1% low is at 299, so you're not going to be having any problems with the frame time either. It's going to be very smooth, and I suspect budding esports players are going to have a good time on this GPU in this game. And Fortnite on DirectX 11 set to the low preset sees just crazy frame rates. We're getting 555 on average, which is probably the highest we've ever seen here on the channel, and the 1% low is also looking good here as well. When we go to 1440p, we do drop below 400 FPS. Yeah, I know, we're not even getting 400 FPS, but still, that is a fantastic amount of performance here, and the 1% low also is holding up quite well too. So performance is absolutely great in these esports games, but they run fine on something like a GTX 1060 anyway, so who would have thought a GPU like this was going to have a great time? Admittedly, the 7800X3D is certainly pulling its weight here, so do expect slightly less performance depending on which CPU you go with, but if you wanted to get into esports games, I recommend something like a Ryzen 5 7600 or something like that would be a good pairing for this graphics card. Ray tracing is something that the 5060 technically can do, and in Cyberpunk it's really not too bad on the RT medium preset, even though we're using DLSS set to quality. At 1080p with DLSS, we're getting around 83 FPS on average with a 1% low of 61, so the VRAM's holding up here. But then when we go up to 1440p, we do drop below 60 FPS with a 1% low of 42, so it's kind of a smooth, consistent frame rate. It's just not a fluid one, if that makes sense. Either way though, I just recommend sticking to rasterization or doing some settings tweaking here, as 52 FPS isn't the best for a first-person game in my opinion. The Witcher 3, however, on the RT preset is an absolute fail. Across both resolutions, it seems the 5060 does not have enough VRAM, as we were faced with constant stutters throughout our testing. Now, the average frame rate of 63 FPS at 1080p might not seem too bad, but when we look at the 1% low of 2, yes, that's not particularly brilliant, and it's not playable by any stretch of the imagination. And it's basically the same story at 1440p, just with a lower average frame rate and just the same amount of stutter. So despite the RTX branding on this graphics card, ray tracing is certainly not a recommendation of mine for this. It just doesn't have enough VRAM, and even then I don't think it's got enough horsepower underneath its bonnet, or its cooler is probably a more apt description of that. But to be honest, Cyberpunk got on sort of okay, but I think you're just better off going with rasterization there anyways. And then there's The Witcher 3, where performance was just unplayable and it was not very good at all. But if Nvidia gave it like 10 or 12 gigabytes of VRAM, we wouldn't be having that problem, would we? So yeah, I can confidently say the 5060 is 100% a 1080p gaming graphics card. This is because performance here was just simply better than 1440p, and it makes a lot more sense. Most of the games were hovering above 60 FPS. When I say hovering, I don't think that's a fair word to use. Some of these games got way more than 60 FPS. And the only fail here is The Witcher 3 with ray tracing enabled. Performance is just not great at all with that 1% low of just 2. But there is good news, because the 8GB of VRAM mostly held up at 1080p, especially when games were set to high or even ultra, which is great to see, but in a few years time I'm not sure if this would be the case. However, if you wanted to play at 1440p, you could always enable DLSS upscaling onto quality, as you'd get slightly, well not even slightly, you'd get a much sharper image than native Full HD, and you'd get roughly the same performance as well, so I think that's probably the smart option there. Native 1440p, however, isn't really the smart option. Most games here will still perform pretty decently. Admittedly, most of the games in the benchmarking roster today were quite optimised, but hey, the unoptimised ones, like Star Wars Jedi Survivor, drop below 60 FPS, so if you're playing Unreal Engine slop, your 1440p is going to be kind of out of the question for this. No, it's not just a matter of VRAM or, well, lack thereof on this GPU, it also doesn't really have the horsepower. Despite that, I think if Nvidia gave this GPU 10 or even 12GB of VRAM, it would be a much more well-received and well-performing GPU at high resolutions, and we sure wouldn't see that issue in The Witcher 3 if it had more video memory. So is the RTX 5060 worth it? To be honest, I'm not quite sure, but I'll do my best to break it down for you. If you're after a solid 1440p AAA gaming experience, this probably isn't the graphics card for you. Here I'd recommend at least an RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, as that's got a lot more VRAM, double in fact, and you won't be running into any VRAM related problems at 1440p for a good few years to come. Admittedly, it's much more in terms of cost, but over the long term, you'd probably end up paying less as you'd upgrade a 5060 much earlier than a 5060 Ti 16GB. However, if you only play esports games, I think the 5060 is fine. It plays these games with absolutely zero problems, and if you pair it with a solid CPU, you're going to be getting absolutely absurd frame rates, so it's not really going to be a problem in these games, even at Quad HD. Oh, and a big win, it's got over the more expensive and bigger Nvidia graphics cards. It's got a single PCIe 8-pin for its power, no more 12V 2x6 or whatever they call it, so the cable won't melt basically. But if you want to see how a GPU with double the VRAM of this gets on, you can watch the 9060 XT 16GB in this video. I think you might like that one. With that being said, I'll catch you in the next one.